Desperation has a specific taste, metallic and bitter like old coins. I could feel it in my mouth as I stared at my bank balance after my third rental rejection in New York City. The promotion had seemed like a dream come true. Project manager at a multinational company, triple my previous salary. But the reality of the city's rental prices was a nightmare. My story wasn't unique. Jessica, my best friend, had warned me about the dangers of rushing into a rental. She had her own scars, 3 months living with a stalker who almost drove her insane. Better to sleep at the office than under the same roof as a predator, she had said. Mark's listing felt like an answer to my prayers. Furnished room for $800 in a well-located house, 5 minutes from the subway. The photos showed a clean, organized space with that homey feeling empty apartments never have. Mark was tall and thin, his pale complexion suggesting years of avoiding the sun. His movements were deliberate, as if every gesture had been rehearsed hundreds of times in front of a mirror. But it was his eyes that should have warned me. Dark and empty, like bottomless wells that swallowed light. "Lisa, right?" he said, pronouncing my name just slightly off, making me want to correct him, but I didn't. His gaze traveled over my body in a way that made me feel exposed, like my clothes were made of glass. The house was an old 1940s building, the kind with a personality of its own, the kind of place that whispers stories through its walls. The room was spacious, with a large window facing the backyard. A heavy antique bed dominated the space, its mattress sagging from years of use. "The other tenants always loved this room," he commented casually, his fingers grazing the doorframe in a way that made me shiver, though none of them stayed too long. Young people these days are so restless. At first, the rules seemed reasonable, almost protective. No visitors after 10 p.m. Notify him if I plan to sleep elsewhere. Keep the common areas clean. But soon, the list grew, became more invasive. For safety. No locking doors, even the bathroom. For control, I had to inform him of all visitors in advance. For concern, I had to share my location in real time. The first signs were subtle. The scent of his cologne, sweet and metallic on my freshly washed clothes. Objects slightly out of place in my room. A hairbrush turned the wrong way, a drawer not fully closed, a book at a different angle. The feeling of being watched was constant. The bathroom window faced the hallway, where Mark frequently organized things. His footsteps always seemed in sync with my most private moments. Mark's control intensified daily, seemingly casual comments about my clothes. "That skirt's a little short for work, don't you think, Lisa?" Observations about my schedule. Yuki. "Got home late last night. Were you with someone special?" Then my underwear started disappearing. At first it was pieces I rarely wore, easy to doubt my memory. Then it was newer items, some with the tags still on. Days later, they would reappear in the laundry, with suspicious stains and that same metallic perfume scent. The invitations became more insistent, more threatening. "Let's have dinner, Lisa. You need to eat better." The tone was always soft, but with a veiled threat. "Why don't we watch a movie? I have a special collection in my room." His reactions to my refusals grew more aggressive. At first, slamming doors, then broken objects, then whispered threats that barely masked his rage. "You know, Lisa, ungrateful tenants tend to have unpleasant accidents." The extra lock on my bedroom door was my first attempt at protection. Mark's reaction was immediate and violent. The pounding started at 2:17 a.m. I remember the exact time because the red numbers on my digital clock flickered as I lay frozen in fear, listening to his voice, distorted with rage. "This is my house. You have no right." Through the thin wooden door, his breath sounded like a wounded animal. The scratching of his nails against the wood formed patterns, not random but methodical, almost ritualistic. "Lisa. Lisa. Why do you force me to act like this? After everything I've done for you?" His voice swung between fury and a sickening sweetness. "I watch you sleep, you know. You're so perfect when you're unconscious." Julia appeared like a ghost, pale, trembling, her eyes haunted. "I had to warn you," she said, gripping her coffee mug like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. "Before it's too late. Before it happens to you like it did to the others." The stories were a catalogue of horrors. Hidden cameras in intimate places, live streams for paying customers, an entire network of voyeurism and exploitation. He has 5 known restraining orders, Julia explained. Probably more under different names. It's always the same pattern. Young women, desperate, vulnerable. But the worst part was learning about the ones who chose not to leave. Some simply vanished. Others were found, but they were never the same again. The discovery of the basement was an accident, a door left unlocked during one of Mark's rare absences. The first thing that hit me was the smell, mold mixed with something darker, something rotting. The walls were lined with shelves meticulously organized. Each box was labeled with names and dates. Inside were souvenirs, catalogued with precision, underwear, locks of hair, personal objects, some stained in ways that made me gag. The entire special section held cameras and recording equipment. Monitors displayed different rooms of the house in real time. One screen showed my bedroom, multiple angles, including one from above my bed, and in the corner, a grotesque altar, photos of women. All young, all with expressions that grew emptier over time. Some I recognized from missing person reports. The creak of the door pulled me from my drugged sleep. I later learned he had been lacing the kitchen water. Mark's silhouette filled the doorway, his figure warped by the darkness. "We can't let you leave, Lisa," he whispered, sitting on the edge of my bed like a concerned father. "You're too special, too perfect." Something metallic glinted in his hand. Not a knife, handcuffs. The others resisted at first too, he continued, his voice eerily gentle. But they all learned to appreciate our special arrangement. That's when I noticed the scratches on the walls, partially covered by fresh paint, words carved into the wood, stories of terror written by desperate hands. The escape was a nightmare of adrenaline and calculated terror. Mark had prepared the house like a trap, doors strategically locked, windows nailed shut, escape routes blocked. His laughter echoed through the hallways, not manic, but methodical, the laughter of a predator who had done this before. "There's nowhere to go, Lisa." His voice drifted from all directions. "This is your home now, forever." The police took exactly 12 minutes to arrive, the longest 12 minutes of my life. They found Mark in the basement, calmly organizing his collection. He smiled as they cuffed him, his gaze locked on me with chilling certainty. "You'll come back," he whispered as they led him away. They all come back, one way or another. The investigation revealed a systematic horror the media barely scratched the surface of. Dozens of victims, different cities, some missing, some silenced by threats or shame. The surveillance system was sophisticated, live streaming for a select audience willing to pay obscene amounts for exclusive content. Mark wasn't just a lone predator. He was part of something bigger, something darker. The trauma doesn't end with the rescue. I developed specific phobias. I can't live alone. The silence suffocates me. But I can't live with roommates either. Every nighttime noise triggers alarms in my mind. The letters still come. No return address. Just that handwriting I learned to fear. "I miss you, Lisa. Your room is just the way you left it." The real horror isn't what happened. It's what almost happened. The dark possibilities my mind can't stop exploring. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, I hear footsteps in the hallway. I smell that metallic cologne. I see shadows shifting at the edges of my vision. Because evil doesn't need haunted houses or supernatural monsters. Sometimes it comes with a polite smile and an affordable rent, and it leaves scars that no change of address can erase. Police. Report. Investigation ongoing. Key multiple victims identified. Evidence of an organized exploitation network. Suspect maintains contact with former victims. Continuous protection recommended. Fear has a specific smell. It's not just adrenaline or cold sweat. It's something more primal, more visceral. That smell had clung to room 237 in Oakwood Hall since the first day, though I only realized it later. Blackwood University had been my first choice, mainly because of the full-ride scholarship that would let me escape a dysfunctional family. The dorm was old, built in the 50s, with dark stories whispered by upperclassmen about disappearances and unexplained events. None of that mattered. This was my chance to start over. Ethan was already there when I arrived, methodically organizing, his belongings in patterns that seemed to follow some incomprehensible logic. Tall and thin, his pale skin suggested years without sunlight. His movements were too precise, as if every gesture had been rehearsed hundreds of times. But it was his eyes that unsettled me first, a pale gray that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Pupils just slightly too large, dilating and contracting in rhythms that didn't match the lighting around him. "You have interesting sleep patterns," were his first words to me, not "hey" or "welcome." And how the hell could he know anything? About my sleep patterns? We had known each other for less than 5 minutes. The questions started subtly. Bedtime, preferred sleeping position, how often I dreamed. Ethan took notes in a black notebook, his small, precise handwriting filling page after page. At the time, I thought he was just eccentric, maybe an overzealous psychology major. But the questions became more invasive as the days passed. History of sleep paralysis, any experiences with sleepwalking, dream recall frequency. Every answer was meticulously documented, accompanied by strange symbols that made my eyes ache when I tried to focus on them. The whispers started in the second week. I woke up at 3:17 a.m., the exact time burned into my brain, to the sound of his voice. Not normal words, but an obsessive litany of details about me. Subject exhibits irregular breathing patterns during REM phase, muscular resistance above average during induced states, assimilation potential classified as exceptional. The first changes to my room were so subtle, I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. Her drawer slightly misaligned, clothes folded differently, tiny marks on the window frame like someone had been watching from outside. My pillow started to smell strange in the mornings, a chemical sweetness that made my head spin and left gaps in my memory. I woke up with small marks on my arms like needle pricks, forming geometric patterns on my skin. Ethan was everywhere, in the reflections of classroom windows, always watching, in the library shadows, taking notes. He knew details about private conversations I had on campus, quoted messages I had never shown to anyone. Ethan's room was a shrine to clinical obsession. I took advantage of his absence during a lecture to investigate, something I should have done much earlier. What I found defied comprehension. Behind his carefully aligned posters, the walls were covered in microscopic handwriting. Not just about me, but about dozens of others: sleep patterns, breathing frequencies, muscle resistance during altered states of consciousness, diagrams of faces in different expressions, each muscle catalogued and analyzed with disturbing precision. His ordinary-looking bookshelf was a facade. Behind the books, I found vials carefully labeled, filled with liquids in impossible colors. Some pulsed faintly, as if alive. The labels listed chemical names I had never heard of, followed by cryptic notes: mental synchronization inducer, transfer catalyst, original identity suppressor. But it was his locked desk drawer that held the real horror. Breaking it open was easier than I expected, like he wanted it to be found. Inside, hundreds of meticulously organized photographs. All of me, all taken while I was sleeping. His most recent diary documented a progression into madness. The first pages were clinical, scientific. Day 1. New subject presents ideal characteristics. Natural resistance to suggestion above average. Assimilation potential exceptional. Day 12. First phase of chemical conditioning initiated. Subject responding well to basic compounds. Mental barriers beginning to weaken. But the later entries turned more disturbing. Day 23. Synchronization progressing. I can feel his dreams now. His memories are starting to blend with mine. The substitution process will be smoother this time. Day 35. The others are pleased with the progress. This host will be perfect for the next phase. His essence is compatible. And the final pages were pure insanity. He is perfect, perfect, perfect. Soon I will be him, completely him. His life will be my life. His essence, my essence. His existence, erased and rewritten. Substitution imminent. A folder labeled History of Successes revealed an even more horrifying truth. Ethan wasn't a person. He was a collection of people. Photographs dating back decades showed different Ethans, each slightly different from the last, all with those same empty eyes, that same artificial smile. His detailed reports documented each substitution, how the original identity was gradually erased and rewritten, how the host was chemically and psychologically prepared, how the transfer was carried out. The failures were documented with equal precision. Photographs of faces frozen in terror, bodies in various stages of transformation. Some seemed to be changing shape, their features melting and reconfiguring in impossible ways. It was the smell that woke me up. That same sweet chemical odor, stronger than ever. I opened my eyes to find Ethan standing beside my bed, completely still. In the dim moonlight, his face looked wrong, like a mask, poorly fitted over something that wasn't quite human. "Fascinating," he whispered, his voice now layered, multiple voices speaking at once. "Your fear has a unique flavor." In his hands, a syringe gleamed, filled with a liquid that pulsed with its own light. His eyes were no longer gray. They were completely black, reflecting my distorted face in their glassy surface. "The process is almost complete," he murmured, leaning closer. "Your mental defenses are perfectly eroded. The substitution will be flawless." "You should feel honored," Ethan continued, his voice shifting tones with each sentence. "Few are chosen to transcend, to evolve." As he spoke, his face began to change. His skin melted, then reformed, flashing different faces underneath. Men, women, young, old, all with those same empty eyes. "We are the next step in evolution," he explained, like a professor giving a lecture. "Individual identity is a primitive prison. We transcend, we become others, we multiply." The syringe pulsed in sync with my heartbeat. "The others are waiting," he whispered. "So many others. All of us. All you." That's when I realized we weren't alone in the room. Figures emerged from the shadows, all with the same artificial smile, the same empty stare, all slightly different, but fundamentally the same. "Welcome to the hive," they said in perfect unison. "Welcome to evolution." Their faces were constantly shifting now, melting and reforming like wax. I saw people I recognized, missing students, professors who had subtly changed over the semesters, staff members who looked different each year. "The university is only the beginning," Ethan explained. "So many young minds, so malleable, perfect for substitution." What followed was a nightmare of struggle and horror. Ethan, or whatever he was inhumanly strong. His limbs bent at impossible angles, his body contorted in ways that defied anatomy. The syringe nearly pierced my skin multiple times, the liquid inside humming with a silent song that made my mind want to unravel. The other figures watched with clinical interest, taking notes in identical black notebooks. "Why resist?" they asked in that eerily synchronized harmony. "We can be you better than you can. We can perfect your existence." The police investigation uncovered horrors that the authorities tried to suppress. Ethan's room contained evidence of dozens of substitutions, some dating back decades. The chemical compounds found in his possession defied analysis. Some seemed to alter reality itself. Others reacted impossibly with human DNA, creating patterns that scientists refused to discuss. The cult of the replacements was far larger than anyone imagined. Dormant cells in universities across the country, always watching, always selecting, always substituting. The terror doesn't end with escape. I developed severe insomnia. The fear of sleeping, of being watched, never fully fades. Mirrors became a problem. Sometimes my reflection lags behind, like it's waiting for me to turn my back. The photos keep arriving, always in envelopes with no return address, always showing me asleep in my new apartment. Each photo is marked with the same impossible symbols that make my eyes burn. On the back, always the same handwritten messages, but the handwriting is different every time. The process has already begun. How many of us exist now? Look around. Who has already been replaced? The true horror isn't the pursuit. It isn't the cult. It isn't even the photos, it's the doubt. The constant gnawing doubt about my own identity. Because sometimes, on the quietest nights, I find myself whispering the same ritual words. Sometimes my fingers drum out the same complex patterns without my conscious control. And sometimes, I wonder if I really escaped that night, or if the substitution was successful, if I am just another copy, spreading the evolution without even knowing. My reflection smiles in the mirror when I'm not smiling, and my eyes are completely black. Hopelessness has a smell. It's not just mildew or damp wood, it's something deeper, more rotten. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped into Luke's house. At the time, I thought anything would be better than living in my car. One more missed rent payment had left me with no options. The ad had seemed too good to be true. Furnished room, $400 a month, only one rule. Basement and attic strictly off limits. Luke was tall and thin, with a sickly pallor that suggested years without sunlight. His movements were too precise, too practiced, like each gesture had been rehearsed hundreds of times. But it was his eyes that should have warned me, Gray. Lifeless, they didn't reflect light, they absorbed it. The rules are simple, he said, his monotone voice echoing through the empty walls. Your room is your sanctuary. My house is your home. But the basement and attic are private, for medical reasons. The room was bigger than expected, furnished with antique pieces that seemed to whisper stories. The oval mirror on the wall had dark stains forming strange patterns. The bed creaked, loudly when I sat on it, a high-pitched sound, almost like a distant scream. The noises started on the third night. They weren't the usual old house creaks. They were rhythmic, methodical. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Like something heavy being dragged down the hallway. Always at 3:17 a.m., always lasting exactly 7 minutes. Then came the smell. Not the musty scent of an old house, but something deeper, more organic, a metallic odor that made my tongue tingle and my stomach turn. It was strongest near the basement vents, which always seemed to pulse slightly. Luke had strange routines. He spent hours standing in the hallway, staring at the wall. Sometimes I'd find him in the kitchen at 4 a.m., meticulously organizing dozens of vials filled with colorful liquids. I never saw him eat. Not once. The first signs of intrusion were subtle. A drawer slightly misaligned, clothes folded differently. Then it became more obvious. Damp, dark stains on my clothes, deep scratches inside my drawers. But the worst part was the dreams. Dreams of someone, something, standing by my bed, watching. The next morning I found long, thin fingerprints in the dust on my nightstand, like someone had stood there for hours, completely still. The basement door wasn't locked that night. Luke had gone out, something about a nighttime collection. The silence in the house felt different, expectant. The creak of the door sounded like a warning scream. The stairs descended into darkness like an open throat. My flashlight revealed walls covered in symbols carved into the wood, spirals, patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering light. The smell down here was unbearable, a mix of decay, chemicals, and something more primitive, more wrong. The basement was a maze of narrow hallways. Each one ended in identical doors. Some were locked. Others, I wished had been. One room was lined with shelves full of vials. Inside were liquids in impossible colors. Shapes moved inside them. Not reflections, not bubbles. Something alive. Another room had walls covered in photographs, hundreds of them. All of people sleeping, their expressions twisted in terror. With growing horror, I recognized some of the clothes in the photos. They were mine. The most recent ones were of me. The last door was locked, but the stench coming from behind it was unmistakable. Through a small gap, I saw metal tables, stained dark surgical instruments arranged with obsessive precision, large containers filled with cloudy liquid. Inside them, pale shapes floated. The walls were covered in anatomical diagrams, but they weren't normal. They showed impossible modifications to the human body. Notes were scribbled in the margins. Physical transcendence, conscious metamorphosis. The handwriting started normal, but gradually became frantic, illegible scratches. An open journal revealed the horrific truth. Luke wasn't a man, not anymore. The last entry of his original self, Dr. Lucas Hammond, was dated 1987. Whatever occupied his body now was something else. The creak of the staircase snapped me back to reality. Luke was coming back. I ran back to my room, heart pounding. Then came the sounds, muffled screams, the wet sound of flesh and being processed. I tried to sleep, pretend normalcy. That's when I smelled it, that familiar mix of chemicals and rot. I slowly opened my eyes. Luke was leaning over my bed. His face was inches from mine, but it wasn't a face anymore. His skin was melting, revealing something underneath, something that pulsed and twisted. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were compound, like an insect's, reflecting my terror in dozens of faceted lenses. "Fascinating," he whispered. His voice was now layered, a chorus of overlapping whispers. "Fear has such a delicious scent." What followed was a nightmare of adrenaline and terror. Luke moved in ways that shouldn't be possible. His limbs bent at unnatural angles, his skin slipping and shifting, revealing something dark and chitinous underneath. I managed to escape through the window, but the sound of his footsteps, far more than two, followed me. His laughter was the worst part, wet, sloppy, like raw meat being torn apart. The police investigation uncovered horrors that the media refused to publish. Dozens of missing persons cases spanning decades. In the basement, they found evidence of experiments that defied human understanding. The real Dr. Hammond had been a brilliant scientist studying accelerated evolution. His last known research spoke of a revolutionary discovery, something about malleable existence and conscious transformation. But the trauma doesn't end when you escape. The nightmares never stop. Dreams of extra limbs growing, of skin melting away to reveal something ancient underneath, something hungry. I developed a severe phobia of mirrors. Sometimes when I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye, it looks wrong, like something is trying to push through. But the worst part? Luke is still out there. The house was demolished, but he just moved on. The disappearances continue. Always people looking for cheap housing, always preceded by tempting rental ads. Sometimes I get letters, no return address, just those same symbols I saw in the basement. Inside, I always find photographs, photos of me, sleeping in my new apartment, and on the back, always the same message, in familiar handwriting. The metamorphosis is only beginning. Final note, excerpt from Police Report 2024. Remains suggest extensive genetic modifications. DNA samples do not match any known species. Maximum containment recommended. We've reached the end of these 3 disturbing stories that reveal how true horror can arise from the most ordinary situations. If these accounts made you rethink living with strangers, walking alone, or exploring abandoned places, consider subscribing to the channel for more real-life horror stories. Your subscription and shares help us continue bringing cases that challenge our understanding of reality. Let me know in the comments, which story impacted you the most? Was it the psychological terror of locked doors, the real threat in glass walls, or the horrors of The Watcher? Have you ever experienced something similar, or do you know someone who has? Share your story. Don't forget to leave a like and turn on notifications to be alerted about new disturbing cases like these. Until the next video, if you still have the courage to live with strangers,